James Williams was dismissed solely because of his skin color. They told him he wasn't good enough, but a month later, he returned to the same office as their main partner and fired those who arrogantly overlooked his talent. They thought they owned the world, but their delusions led to the downfall of the entire team. What James did will shock even those who have seen much. But let's start from the beginning. James Williams, a 35-year-old man with a confident posture and impeccable style, stood in front of the mirror in his bright, minimalist bedroom, preparing for an important day. His skin was dark mahogany, smooth and well-groomed, and his eyes were deep, filled with determination. Every time he aimed for success, a sense of responsibility mixed with memories of the obstacles he'd had to overcome because of his skin color. Today's interview at Lexor Finance was a chance he had been preparing for his entire life. James adjusted his dark blue tie, smoothing it down along his light gray shirt. His custom-made suit fit perfectly, emphasizing his athletic build and confidence. In his hands was a black leather briefcase, into which he had carefully placed his recommendations, reports, and examples of successful projects, each one proof of his competence, talent, and professionalism. As he approached the company building, his eyes studied the architecture, a skyscraper with mirrored facades that seemed to symbolize success and inaccessibility. Inside, the white marble floors and glass partitions reinforced a sense of modernity and power. He approached the reception desk, where a young woman barely glanced at him before giving him a perfunctory smile and directing him to the elevator. Her gaze was cold, and James felt a slight tension, but it didn't stop him. Such situations were all too familiar. Riding up to the top floor, James caught his reflection in the mirrored elevator walls. He reminded himself that he was prepared for anything. Memories of his career flashed in his mind, late nights spent on reports, challenging projects that he had conquered. His confidence was unshakable. He was a true professional, and no one could refuse him without a valid reason. The elevator doors opened, and James confidently walked toward the interview room. As he entered the spacious room, filled with daylight, he immediately noticed Matthew Harper. A short, slender white man, Harper wore a white shirt and a gray jacket, seated behind a massive oak desk. Matthew did not smile. His cold eyes regarded James as just another routine task, rather than a potential employee. James felt his attention drawn to Harper's every movement. He avoided eye contact, his lips barely pressed together, and his fingers tapped rhythmically on the desk. It seemed like he had already made his decision before the conversation even began. But James, used to such reactions, decided to ignore these signs. He knew that the most important thing in an interview was to showcase his professional qualities. "Have a seat," Matthew said curtly, not raising his eyes from James's resume folder. James sat on the edge of the leather chair, keeping his back straight. He wanted to make a good impression, though deep down, an unpleasant feeling was growing that the interview would not be easy. Matthew slowly flipped through a few pages of James's resume and finally looked up. "Are you sure you want to apply for this position?" he asked disdainfully, his voice dripping with barely concealed mockery. James felt his inner calm slightly waver. He was used to distrust, but these words stung his pride. Nonetheless, he answered calmly, trying not to show his emotions. "Yes, I'm sure," James said firmly, looking directly into Harper's eyes. "I have enough experience and skills for this job." Matthew squinted, studying James as if scrutinizing him in the finest detail, allowing himself a cold smile. There was something unpleasant in his gaze that made James tense. "We're not looking for someone of your level," Matthew said indifferently, skillfully masking his true intentions with professional decorum. His voice was cold and detached, as if this was a simple fact, not open for discussion. These words triggered an instant surge of anger in James. He remained silent, but inside he was boiling. It hurt him that his qualifications and knowledge were being reduced to nothing because he had been born with a different skin color. Matthew didn't care about his achievements, his work, or his efforts. He saw only what he wanted to see, a biased, stereotypical image. James struggled to contain his indignation. He wanted to respond sharply, to say everything he had bottled up over the years of fighting against injustice. But he knew that it wouldn't change the situation. The world was harsh to those who didn't fit its standards. He took a deep breath, tightened his grip on his briefcase, and slowly stood up. "Thank you for your time," James said, keeping his composure, though inside he was seething. He turned and walked toward the exit. His footsteps echoed through the empty corridor, but each step felt like a blow to his dignity. When he stepped outside, the fresh wind brushed against his face, gently tugging at the collar of his jacket. He stood on the sidewalk, watching the passers-by, who went on with their lives, unaware of what had just happened in his world. After the humiliating rejection at Lexor Finance, James Williams spent several days in a state of rage and deep disappointment. He replayed the moment when Matthew Harper uttered those contemptuous words over and over in his mind. Each memory agitated him, but James was not the type to give up or give in to emotions. He was used to facing difficulties and overcoming them, and this case was no exception. Sitting at his kitchen table in front of his laptop, James thought about how he could use this pain and anger to his advantage. He knew that revenge should be sweet but not hasty, and most importantly, it should be built on success. The rejection from Lexor Finance became his motivation to do something bigger, to create something unique, innovative, and free from bias and discrimination. He had been nurturing ideas for years. From his previous jobs, James had observed the market and seen gaps that could be filled with new financial tools. He developed a plan to create a startup, a platform that would offer revolutionary ways to manage investments and cash flow for large companies. It was something that could change the rules of the game in the industry. Without wasting time, James began to act. He invested his personal savings, accumulated over many years of work, and contacted people in the industry he trusted. He had strong contacts, financial analysts, programmers, marketing specialists. They respected him for his professionalism and willingness to take risks, knowing that with James, they could build something great. He managed to assemble a small but incredibly talented team that shared his vision. Every day was filled with hard work, developing algorithms, testing software, negotiating with potential clients and investors. James spent hours analyzing the market, perfecting the product, and fine-tuning every process to perfection. His experience in the financial industry, combined with his technical savvy, gave him the insight to create something truly unique. In just a few weeks, James's company began to gain momentum. Initially skeptical investors started showing active interest as they saw real results and potential. James signed his first major contract with one of the country's leading banks. His platform proved its effectiveness, increasing the bank's profits, which attracted even more attention from the financial community. A month after the launch, his startup was already holding a stable position in the market, and his development was being talked about in financial forums and professional circles. Meanwhile, James continued working tirelessly, barely noticing the passing days. He had no time for regrets or bitterness. His life was filled with work, and with every new achievement, he felt as if he was reclaiming his dignity and confidence. But one morning, as he was checking his email, James came across a message that made him stop. He read it in disbelief. The email was from the same company, Lexor Finance, which had rejected him just a month ago. They were now offering him a meeting to discuss a potential partnership. James smirked as he looked at his laptop screen. Memories of that humiliating interview flashed through his mind, but now he was in a completely different position. Lexor Finance could no longer ignore his success. They needed his platform. The tables had turned. Now it was not he who was looking for a job, but they who had come to him, desperately needing his product. The email was written in an official tone, with emphasized politeness, but James knew there was more behind it. After all, the market is a place where the strongest survive, and now they realized they needed someone they had once considered unworthy. He pondered his next move, feeling the sweet anticipation of revenge. James decided not to delay. Sitting down at the negotiating table with Lexor Finance, he maintained a cold politeness, watching as the company's representatives, including Matthew Harper, tensed in his presence. They knew they were now dependent on his decision. Every argument they made was filled with nervousness and desperation. At the end of the meeting, James smiled slightly as he signed the contract. A sly grin played on his lips as he put his signature down, fully aware that they were now in his hands. This deal was his triumph, and he understood perfectly that this was just the beginning. Now that they were dependent on him, James knew something unexpected awaited them. He left the meeting room, leaving behind cold silence and the defeated gazes of those who, just a month ago, had deemed him unworthy. The day James had been eagerly waiting for had arrived. Today, he was to officially enter the Lexor Finance office, but not as a job seeker, as their main partner, a man whose word would determine the company's future. In the morning, he prepared meticulously, as if getting ready for battle. But this was not a fight where fists were used. It was a battlefield of minds, influence, and power. When James stood before the mirror in his spacious bedroom, his reflection spoke of his new self. Unlike the day he had left this office feeling humiliated, today he looked unshakably confident. His black suit fit perfectly, accentuating his athletic build. A dark purple tie added depth and strength to his appearance. His eyes, usually calm, were now burning with determination and a hidden threat. He was no longer someone who could be humiliated or rejected without consequences. The Lexor Finance office greeted him with its usual cold atmosphere. Marble floors, glass walls, gleaming cleanliness, and the echo of footsteps reverberating in the long corridors. James felt completely different here now. He was the one upon whom the future of this place depended. He was met by the same receptionist who had once politely ignored him. This time, her gaze was full of confusion and nervousness. She clearly hadn't expected to see him in this capacity. James politely nodded, but inwardly savored the situation. Walking toward the conference room, James opened the door and entered with the confidence of someone who owned the place. Inside, the Lexor Finance representatives were already waiting, including the very man, Matthew Harper. Matthew sat at the center of the table, his face expressionless, but James noticed the slight press of his lips and the nervous clenching of his fingers on the armrest of his chair. James slowly took a seat opposite him, not rushing to start the meeting. He could feel the heavy silence hanging in the room, as if no one knew what to expect from the man who had become indispensable to the company over the past month. As always, Matthew began the meeting with his usual business-like demeanor. "Welcome, Mr. Williams. We're pleased that you agreed to meet with us and discuss the details of our partnership. We would like to—" "Hold on," James interrupted him calmly, raising his hand and looking directly into Matthew's eyes. There was not a trace of aggression in his voice, only calm confidence. "I think before we get to discussing the details, there are a few things I'd like to address." The room grew even quieter. James could feel everyone holding their breath, unsure of where this deviation from the usual script would lead. Matthew squinted, clearly not expecting such a start, but he nodded, though his fingers were now tapping the table with noticeable nervousness. "First of all," James began, folding his arms on the table and leaning slightly forward, "I appreciate that we were able to reach an agreement on collaboration. It's undoubtedly an important step for both sides, but I have conditions without which this partnership cannot continue." He spoke calmly, but his words were sharp as a blade. Matthew and the other attendees exchanged glances, feeling the coldness settling in the air. "I've thoroughly reviewed your team, and I understand that in order to achieve the goals we've set, changes will be necessary," James continued, his voice clear and confident. "Some key positions in your company require people with a different level of competence and approach to work." Matthew paled. He understood that this was about those who had been responsible for rejecting James, but he remained silent, waiting for further explanation. James paused for a moment, letting his words sink into the room's silence, then continued. "I would like those employees who do not meet our standards to be dismissed. Specifically, those who made decisions without properly analyzing the facts and personal qualities of the candidates. We need people capable of strategic thinking and making decisions based on real data, not personal biases." These words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Everyone in the room, except James, froze. He could see the change in Matthew's face. Cold sweat appeared on his forehead, and his hands moved even faster. He clearly realized that the discussion was about him. "I don't think that's—" Matthew began, trying to gather his thoughts and defend himself, but James interrupted him with a cold smile. "This is not negotiable," James said calmly. "My condition is not a whim. It's a necessity for successful cooperation. Otherwise, we won't be able to work together." Matthew felt the ground slipping from under his feet. His career, his status, everything he had built was now in jeopardy. He sat in the room, feeling as though he was losing control of the situation. For the first time in a long while, he found himself in a position where he couldn't dictate the terms, and this realization awakened fear in him. James, sensing he was in complete control, continued to watch the expressions on his opponents' faces. He didn't need any more words. He already knew he had won. The next morning after the historic meeting, when James left the Lexor Finance building as the victor, the company's office sank into anxious anticipation. Many of the employees, especially those who had witnessed yesterday's meeting, sensed the coming storm. Matthew Harper, despite his outward calm, had spent the night in a state of stress, feeling the looming threat to his career like a Damocles sword. His impeccable reputation at the company was now in question, but he had no idea how quickly everything would fall apart. At the start of the workday, as the first employees gathered in their offices, an announcement about layoffs began to circulate. It was not just an ordinary announcement, but an official letter with a headline that brought anxiety to the office. Changes in company structure, notice of layoffs. The letter informed them of the immediate dismissal of several key company employees, including Matthew Harper himself. He read the letter, feeling his heart sink. His hands trembled as he realized that his career at this company was over. Matthew sat at his desk, staring at the computer screen with the letter open. His mind was in chaos. He couldn't believe this was happening to him, the man who had always been sure of his invincibility and influence. It was bitterly ironic that his downfall was now being caused by the very person he had ruthlessly rejected not long ago, barely concealing his bias. The surrounding employees, learning of their boss's dismissal, were in shock. To many, Matthew had been an authority and a symbol of the old-school leadership. But there were also those who felt a hidden sense of satisfaction, seeing a man they had considered unfair and cold receive his just punishment. James, sitting in his office across the city, received notification that everything had gone according to plan. He calmly took a sip of his coffee, looking out the window of his new office. He didn't need to celebrate or rejoice. It was simply a logical step. He had done what needed to be done. For James, this was not an act of revenge in the traditional sense. It was about restoring justice, removing those who based their decisions on prejudice, discrimination, and personal bias. He recalled the day he had walked out of the Lexor Finance office, humiliated and full of anger. At that moment, standing on the street, he had promised himself that he would achieve justice. And now, just weeks later, his promise had been fulfilled. Matthew Harper and his closest colleagues, who had participated in that unjust interview, no longer worked at the company. It was a symbolic but significant act. Their dismissal served as a reminder to everyone else that prejudice and racism do not go unpunished. For Lexor Finance, this event became a real shock. The loss of several key employees at once shook the company's familiar structure. The entire department responsible for hiring, directly linked to the decision to reject James, was gone. The company's leaders realized that mistakes based on bias and unjust treatment could be far too costly. Through his determination, James had not only changed his own fate, but also forced the company to reconsider its views and management approaches. For many, this dismissal was a lesson, not only for those who remained at Lexor Finance, but for the entire industry. Local financial publications began writing articles about James as the man who changed the game. He became a symbol of the fight for justice in the world of corporate decisions, and his story became an example for those who had ever faced injustice or discrimination. Now James Williams was not just a successful entrepreneur. He was a man who had proven that no walls of bias and discrimination could stop someone driven by determination and justice. His success was the result not only of his talent and hard work, but also of an inner strength that had allowed him to endure humiliation and turn pain into triumph. Sitting in his office and looking out over the city's horizons, James knew this was only the beginning. His name was now associated with success and truth, and he was ready to move forward, breaking down the barriers that had once tried to stop him.